President Trump will return home today from his Asian travels. He's had a lot of headlines in his nearly 2 weeks abroad. And here to break down that entire trip is Professor of Political Science at Wright State University, Laura Lerman. Thank you so much for being here this morning. We appreciate it. I kind of want to just dive right in. There was a lot going on this trip. What do you think was some of the high points of this trip?
I think it was a very successful trip in a number of ways. First and foremost, he reaffirmed our commitment to Asia, and that was extremely important, and that was one of the goals of the trip. I would say Japan and South Korea were probably the most successful legs of the trip. He really hit the ball out of the park with his speech to the South Korean National Assembly. He was very statesmanlike. He stated that we must confront the North Korean crisis together in a united front, and I think that was extremely important, and I think it was a message that the world needed to hear.
Kind of on the opposite end of things, what do you think some of the low points of this trip were?
So there were a couple cringeworthy moments when he stated that he didn't blame China for taking advantage of the United States. I think that was probably not exactly the message that we wanted to convey. There was also a moment recently with this visit in the Philippines where he laughed about a joke about all the journalists when the president of the Philippines, and the Philippines is a very dangerous country for journalists, he stated that, oh, well, journalists are just spies, and the president laughed along. That was not really affirming American values. So I would say those were two sort of cringeworthy moments. And then, of course, the tweets over the weekend, trying to get back into the verbal fight with Kim Jong-un, just not what we need at this moment.
Kind of going back to Kim Jong-un at this point, why have these tweets back and forth between the two and then come out and say, oh, but I would be his friend if he would let me? I mean, it just doesn't make sense.
It appears to be very contradictory, and it's not helpful for trying to establish a unified policy toward North Korea, and it's just not going to move any of us in a direction forward. I agree.
Talking about contradiction, the overall message, do you think, on this trip, do you think it was a little contradictory when you said unite against North Korea, but then U.S. is going to stand alone when it comes to trade?
Exactly. I think that was a big set of messages that came out of the trip, and they were contradictory, that we need a united front in trying to respond to North Korea. Yet the president announced at the APEC meetings on Pacific Economic Cooperation that the United States wants no part of regional trade agreements and that we want to have bilateral trade agreements. And that hurt the United States because right after that was announced, hours later, 11 of the Pacific Rim countries came together and announced a new regional trade pact, one that excludes the United States, and I don't think that's going to be in our interest in the long term.
Do you think the president's overall message of America first could have excluded us or is excluding us from other things that are going on around the country and maybe even other countries themselves and world leaders?
I think America first falls flat in Asia. Asia is a very multilateral region of the world, and to the extent that the United States is perceived to be promoting only our interests, I think we are going to be left out, and I think this regional trade pact was just one example of that. I think the message that was coming from the State Department during this trip, that we need to work with our partners, that's the message that we need to convey. And again, this is a contradiction that we see within the administration. One message from the White House, a separate message from the State Department.
And just wrapping things up really quickly, the president actually tweeted not too long ago that he has a major announcement that he will be making from the White House once he lands back here in the U.S. What do you expect to hear from the president?
Yes, once he overcomes his jet lag from his travels back from Asia, we expect him to announce probably that North Korea will be placed again on the list of state sponsors of terror. They have not been on that list since 2008 under the George W. Bush administration. They were removed from that list as part of the nuclear agreement that was made in 2008. He's also probably going to highlight some of the trade deals that were signed during this trip as well, about $300 billion worth of trade deals. It's going to take a long time to come to fruition. Going to be the hallmark, I think, of what he wants people to remember from his time in Asia.
All right, Professor Laura Lerman, thank you so much of Political Science at Wright State University. Really appreciate you being here this morning and kind of wrapping things up for us.
Great, thank you.